It was supposed to be a normal night, the kind of shift that usually disappears from memory as soon as it ends. The streets were quiet, almost unnaturally so, with closed storefronts, empty sidewalks, and the steady hum of streetlights cutting through the darkness. For a police officer, nights like this often mean long hours of watching and waiting, nothing urgent, nothing out of the ordinary. The patrol car moved slowly through familiar roads, the officer's attention steady but relaxed, expecting nothing more than routine checks until sunrise. Then something felt wrong. On the sidewalk, in a place where no one should have been at that hour, sat a small child. He wasn't moving. He wasn't calling out. He was simply there, crying softly, his small body drawn inward as if trying to take up less space in the world. The officer slowed down, questioning whether exhaustion was playing tricks on his eyes, but as the car came to a stop, there was no mistake. The child was real, and he was alone. Children were not meant to face the night like this, exposed to the cold, the silence, and the uncertainty of not knowing what would happen next. As the officer stepped out of the vehicle, the weight of the moment became clear. The child's face was streaked with dried and fresh tears, his breathing uneven, his posture tense, as if fear had been building for hours with nowhere to go. There were no adults nearby, no movement from surrounding buildings, no voices searching for him. The street offered no answers, only emptiness. The officer understood that this was no longer about schedules, reports, or procedure. This was about a child who had been left without protection, guidance, or reassurance. Time seemed to slow as the officer stood there, realizing that whatever happened next could not be rushed or simplified. This was not a situation that could be fixed in minutes. It was a moment that required patience, presence, and a willingness to stay. Without fully realizing it yet, the officer had already crossed a line between routine duty and personal responsibility. The night continued quietly around them, unaware that on a dark, empty sidewalk, a single decision was about to shape everything that followed. The officer approached the child slowly, careful not to overwhelm him. Sudden movements or loud voices could easily make things worse, and the child already looked as if he had reached the limit of what he could handle. The officer lowered himself to the child's level, not standing over him, not towering above him, but positioning himself so their eyes could meet without pressure. He spoke gently, keeping his voice calm and steady, asking simple questions meant to ground the moment rather than interrogate it. "What is your name? Do you know where you live? Is there someone you're waiting for?" Each question was met with silence or broken attempts to answer that never fully formed into words. The child's lips trembled, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, and his eyes avoided contact, fixed instead on the pavement beneath him. It became clear that the child wasn't refusing to speak out of defiance. He simply couldn't. Fear had taken over where words should have been. The officer noticed how the child flinched at distant sounds, how his breathing quickened whenever a car passed, how his body remained tense even while sitting still. This was not a child who had just stepped outside for a moment. This was a child who had been alone for far too long. The officer paused, allowing silence to exist without trying to force answers out of it. He understood that reassurance came before information. Without touching the child, without crossing boundaries, he let his presence communicate safety. Slowly, the child's crying softened, not because the fear was gone, but because someone had finally stopped and stayed. In that quiet space between questions and answers, the officer began to understand that whatever had happened before this moment had left a mark, and whatever happened next would matter more than any report or procedure. The night was still young, and the situation was far from resolved, but one thing was already certain: this child needed time, patience, and someone willing to listen without rushing him forward. The officer remained beside the child, fully aware that time was passing but equally aware that rushing this moment would only cause more harm. Training and protocol existed for a reason, and the officer knew them well. There were procedures to follow, calls to make, reports to begin. But standing there, listening to the uneven rhythm of the child's breathing and watching the way his small body stayed tense as if danger could return at any second, those rules felt distant. The officer understood that before any official step could be taken, the child needed something far more basic. He needed to feel safe. The officer made a deliberate choice not to stand up, not to create distance, not to turn this interaction into something formal or intimidating. Instead, he stayed seated, grounding himself in the moment, allowing the child to adjust at his own pace. He spoke again, softly, not asking questions this time, but offering reassurance. Simple words, repeated calmly, meant to communicate that the child was not in trouble, that he was not being blamed, and that nothing bad would happen to him right now. The officer kept his tone steady, even when the child's attention drifted or his fear resurfaced. He understood that trust does not appear instantly, especially for a child who has already learned that adults do not always stay. The officer watched carefully, noticing small changes that most people might miss. The way the child's shoulders slowly dropped, the way his breathing became slightly less strained, the way he stopped pulling inward and allowed himself to exist in the open space beside another person. These were not dramatic changes, but they mattered. Each small shift meant that fear was loosening its grip, little by little. The officer resisted the urge to fill the silence with instructions or explanations. Silence, he knew, could be healing when it wasn't threatening. He stayed present, not distracted by the radio, not scanning the street for the next task, but fully focused on the child in front of him. In that moment, the badge on his chest represented more than authority. It represented stability, consistency, and the promise that someone was finally paying attention. The officer understood that whatever had led the child to this sidewalk was not something that could be undone tonight. But he also understood that what happened now would shape how the child remembered this night. Whether it would become another moment of fear, or the first moment of relief. By choosing patience over pressure and compassion over speed, the officer set the foundation for everything that would follow, even though he could not yet see where the night would ultimately lead. The night continued to stretch forward, slow and unhurried, as if time itself had decided to wait. The officer remained with the child, aware of the cold settling deeper into the street and the quiet growing heavier with each passing minute. Without making a show of it, without turning the moment into something dramatic, the officer took off his jacket and gently placed it around the child's shoulders. It was a simple action, but one filled with meaning. The jacket carried warmth, but more than that, it carried reassurance. The child reacted at first with hesitation, his body stiffening slightly, unsure whether to accept the gesture or pull away. The officer did not rush him. He adjusted the jacket carefully, making sure it was loose, comfortable, and not restrictive. He then leaned back slightly, giving the child space, allowing him to decide what felt safe. Slowly, the child relaxed. His breathing steadied, not completely, but enough to suggest that the sharp edge of fear was beginning to dull. The officer noticed how the child's hands unclenched, how his shoulders no longer pressed inward as tightly as before. These were quiet signals, almost invisible, but to someone paying close attention, they meant everything. The officer stayed still, resisting the instinct to check the time or the radio, understanding that presence mattered more than efficiency in this moment. The street remained empty, the city unaware of the small exchange taking place under its sleeping gaze. As minutes turned into longer stretches of silence, the child leaned slightly closer, not touching, but near enough to suggest trust. The officer allowed it without comment, knowing that trust grows best when it is not acknowledged out loud. He continued speaking softly, not with questions, but with calm, steady words meant to anchor the child to the present. He told him that he was safe right now, that no one was angry with him, that he would not be left alone. The words were simple, repeated without impatience, spoken not to persuade but to reassure. The officer understood that fear does not disappear all at once. It fades slowly, in layers, as the mind learns that nothing bad is happening anymore. He stayed attentive, adjusting the jacket when the cold wind shifted, shielding the child from passing gusts, placing himself between the child and the empty street without making it obvious. In doing so, he turned an ordinary sidewalk into a temporary place of safety. The uniform, the badge, the patrol car nearby all faded into the background. What remained was a human moment defined by care rather than authority. The officer knew that this night was far from over and that difficult steps still lay ahead, but he also knew that right now, this was enough. A child was no longer alone in the dark, and that single fact gave the moment its quiet weight. Time moved forward slowly, almost unnoticed, as the night deepened and the temperature dropped further. The officer remained beside the child, aware that the situation could not stay frozen in this quiet moment forever. Eventually, there would be steps to take, calls to make, systems to involve. But for now, the priority was maintaining the fragile calm that had begun to form. The officer carefully reached for his radio and made the necessary notifications in a low voice, choosing his words with care so they would not alarm the child. He requested checks, asked questions, followed procedure, all while keeping his attention anchored on the small figure beside him. Between radio exchanges, he returned his focus fully to the child, ensuring that the sense of safety did not break. The child listened to the unfamiliar sounds without reacting strongly, his earlier panic replaced by quiet exhaustion. The officer noticed how heavy the child's eyelids had become, how his head occasionally tilted forward before jerking back upright. Fear had kept him awake for too long, and now that fear was easing, fatigue was taking its place. The officer adjusted his position slightly, offering support without forcing closeness, creating a stable presence the child could rely on without being overwhelmed. The city remained silent, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement, marking the slow passage of time. No one arrived looking for the child. No hurried footsteps echoed nearby. Each passing minute made that absence more noticeable. The officer continued to wait, patient and alert, understanding that waiting itself was part of the responsibility. Eventually, the child's resistance faded completely. His body relaxed, his breathing slowed, and he drifted into sleep, still wrapped in borrowed warmth, still anchored by the knowledge that someone was there. The officer remained awake, watching carefully, shielding the child from the cold and the emptiness around them. He understood that this sleep was not just physical rest but emotional release, the result of finally feeling safe enough to let go. As the hours passed and the night edged closer to morning, the officer stayed exactly where he was, aware that this quiet stretch of time mattered just as much as whatever decisions would follow. In the stillness, it became clear that the night was no longer about finding quick answers, but about ensuring that the child would not wake up alone again. When morning finally arrived, it did not bring easy answers. The city slowly woke up, but no one came searching for the child. Calls were returned, records were checked, and the reality became impossible to ignore. The child had not been temporarily lost. He had been left behind. There was no urgent panic from a family, no relief-filled reunion waiting just around the corner. The officer listened as the details came together, each one confirming what the quiet night had already suggested. When the child woke up, confused and disoriented, the officer was still there. Nothing had changed in his position or his tone. The consistency mattered. The child did not panic. He did not cry. He simply looked up and saw the same face that had stayed through the night. The officer gently explained what would happen next, using simple words, careful not to promise things he could not control. He took the child's hand and stood up with him, guiding him forward without rushing, without fear. The night had taken many things from that child, but it had not taken everything. One thing remained intact. The knowledge that when it mattered most, someone had stayed. The officer knew he could not fix the past or decide the child's future, but he also knew that this moment would remain with both of them. For one long night, duty had turned into responsibility, and responsibility had turned into compassion. And sometimes, that is enough to change the way a story begins again.